Cool. So yeah, tonight I want to talk to you about, is your component ready for strict mode? And this talk does have a secondary title, which could be how I made the AGGrid types worse when trying to make them better. So I joined AGGrid about, it'll be 2 years ago now. And one of the first things I did as an Angular developer was come in and think, oh, how can I make the types better? But this is a bit of a story of how originally I made them worse before I did eventually make them a lot better. So what am I going to be talking about here? It's a lot of it is focused around strict mode. And so strict mode in Angular is default now and has been for a while. But what it does is it improves the maintainability and helps you catch bugs ahead of time. So once this is enabled, you'll get things like TypeScript strict mode, and also a number of the Angular compiler flags like strict templates. And that's the main one we're going to be focusing on in this talk. So to give you an example and just remind you what strict templates does, if your component has an input, say we've got disabled, and that's a boolean, so it can be true or false. If when you're using that component and you give it a string here, so we know we're giving it the wrong type, then you get this nice red squiggle, and you'll get an error message if you try and build the app saying string isn't assignable to boolean. So it's this really kind of quick feedback while you're coding that can help you write your apps quicker and prevent running into hard to catch bugs. Now, if we look back to version 25 of AGGrid, in our source code, you would have seen our inputs were all typed as any. And what this means is that even with a strict application, you can't do any input validation. So for this feature, get row class, as a user, you don't know whether it needs a boolean, a string, or a function. And you'd have to go and look it up in the documentation. And so it's just no help to you at all. As you can see, we've got all these any's, and so there's no template type checking. So one of the first things I did was, got excited. I can come in and I can help fix this. I can take all the TypeScript information from our grid options interface, and using an abstract syntax tree and parser, which is a whole nother talk, I could take those types and apply them to the Angular interface, well, the Angular component. So instead of saying get row class typed as any, it now has all the correct type information. So get row class is actually a function which takes a parameter and you return either a string or an array of strings. And once we applied this, we then got all the correct strict template checking. So when you passed it a boolean or a string, it would complain, but if you gave it the right type of function, it's all good. So I was excited about this. Version 26 came out. We're saying AGGrid is now fully typed for Angular users, all these improvements. And very quickly, there was a problem. Unfortunately, I managed to catch the problem, I think, before our users noticed, was that we supported this syntax. So what the syntax is, you're just adding a plain attribute. So enable charts here is a Boolean input. But we supported, just having it as a plain attribute instead of using, square brackets and giving it the true or false value. So just doing this should be the same as adding true. But you get this slightly odd error message saying string is not assignable to type Boolean. And that's because when you just use a plain attribute, it's equivalent to assigning the empty string. And so now when we see the code in that form, you can see why it's saying string isn't assignable to Boolean. But we needed to continue to support this plain attribute approach. And this is where input type coercion comes in. And there's two ways of doing this in Angular now. There's a static property called ngAcceptInputType. And then there's also, since Angular 13 with TypeScript 4.3, you can use set and getters with different types, which is an alternative approach to ngAcceptInputType. And it's actually quite been interesting watching the Angular PRs, because up until last month, there was a pull request to deprecate ngAcceptInputType. But I noticed last month that's been closed, and I'm hoping it's going to stay that way, because for us at AGGrid, ngAcceptInputType is a really nice, clean way of applying this input coercion, as I'll go on to show you, as opposed to the set get approach. So if we have a look at this is how you'd use ngAcceptInputType. So it's a static property that you add to your component, and it enables you to widen the accepted types of an input property. So here we've still got our disabled input, and we're saying it's a boolean because, disabled is either true or false. But because of the way the HTML template works, we also need it to accept that empty string value. So here we say ngAcceptInputType underscore disabled. So that name has to match exactly with the input name. And then we're saying this is of type boolean or this empty string value. And so once you add that to your component, the code now compiles and you get no errors. But you have to remember inside your app display component there to convert the empty string to a true value. So the ngAcceptInputType, it's important to notice, it's got that type at the end. That's just to do with typing. In your component, you still need to do the real coercion from the empty string to the boolean. And this doesn't just apply to booleans. You could do something similar for dates. So you could have a date input and have an ngAcceptInputType for date or string. And then maybe in ngOnChanges, you could have a date coercion function. And then, so this would enable users of your component to give string values, because that can often happen when you're retrieving dates from an API. But then you might want to force them to have them as dates. So, there's always decisions to be made when you're using these types. And now, if you don't want to use the ngAcceptInputType, you can do this with get and setters. So since TypeScript 4.3, you're now allowed to have different types for the getter and the setter. So here we're saying the getter is just of type boolean, because that's what the disabled flag should be. Whereas for the set, the value can be a boolean, a string, or a null. So you're encapsulating that same information that we passed to the ngAcceptInputType, but this time in the setter itself. So you might prefer this approach if you're already using getters and setters. This is probably easier to work with than the ngAcceptInputType. But there was still another problem. What if you want to set the disabled flag from an observable stream? Well, then you got another error message saying type null is not assignable to type boolean or empty string. And that's because the async pipe, when it hasn't emitted a value yet, has the type null. So you can see where we might go with this. So our ngAcceptInputType for disabled is boolean, empty string, and null. And then just remember to make sure you validate your coercion function, that it does all the right things for all these different inputs. So then as AGGrid 26.1 came out, we added in all these ngAcceptInputTypes for all the many properties that we had. And then finally, the AGGrid component had all the full typing information, but it was also compliant with strict mode without causing our users to run into lots of pain points. And so you might have some questions, which I'm going to try and preempt now on this. One of them is, well, why not just change the input type? So I'll show you what I mean with this next bit of the slide. So if you say that the input can be a boolean or the empty string, then throughout the rest of your component, you're not going to be able to use that input cleanly. So here maybe you have a function in your component saying is disabled that you just want to be a boolean, but you're going to get this error now saying, well, it's a string or a boolean, and you've leaked the implementation detail of just getting the value into your component throughout the entire code. So so this is why you might want to go down the route of having the ngAcceptInputType, doing the coercion, and hiding that boundary level from the rest of your component. So it keeps your component cleaner and easier to reason with. Another common issue might be, what if it's not your component that has got these incorrect types? So you can use a variety of approaches to get around this. So here we could say the disabled stream, maybe it's a behavior subject. So it's always going to start with a value. So I'm going to say in my template, well, it's non-null, so that you can put an exclamation mark and wrap it all in brackets, and then Angular won't complain about it. Or you can just disable type checking completely with this $any syntax. So this can be useful in certain situations. I haven't used it that much, but sometimes it's the only thing you can do to say, actually, I know what I'm doing, or the type of this component is wrong and I can't fix it, but I know the code works. It's just the typing which is off. Or in this case, you could provide a default value, which might make more sense in your situation. And then if you want to do this on a much wider level, you can tweak the TS config flags, but I recommend doing this at a last resort, because really you want to keep things as strict as possible, because it does give you a lot of benefits in making sure your application is correct and all these things, which I don't think I need to sell to Angular developers. Or you could turn off all the input checking, but again, I wouldn't recommend doing that approach. And if it's not your component, well, then create an issue for the library to fix your types. And hopefully I won't be getting any issues for AGGrid, because I've tried to make them as right as possible. So takeaways. When you're working within a strict mode application, just typing your inputs might not always be enough. As we saw, plain attributes, if we want them used as booleans, or the async pipe. And the two approaches that Angular gives us is we can either use ngAcceptInputType, or we can use the setter and getter with different types. And that's all I've got for you this evening. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope that will help you write components which are easy for others to consume, even if they are using a strict Angular application, which pretty much everyone should be these days.